When a journalist tries to corner J.D. Vance on live TV with provocative questions about his past, he believes he's in command. But then, in a twist no one anticipated, the entire dynamic flips. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Now, picture this. The studio lights blaze on one of America's most watched talk shows. The atmosphere crackles with anticipation as J.D. Vance, our newly inaugurated Vice President, steps onto the set, fresh from taking his oath of office. Vance exudes the quiet confidence of a man with nothing to hide and everything to prove. Yet, Marcus Bennett, the show's host, has other plans. Known for his sharp tongue and liberal leanings, Bennett has spent weeks preparing for this moment. Although his producer promised a respectful discussion about the new administration, the glint in Bennett's eyes reveals a different agenda. As Vance takes his seat, the usual pre-interview pleasantries are rushed and mechanical. Bennett's smile never quite reaches his eyes, and the production team seems unusually tense. Vance, drawing on his Marine Corps training, senses an ambush. Every instinct tells him that Bennett's questions are loaded with hidden landmines. The first question comes wrapped in a smile, yet Vance can't help but notice Bennett's white-knuckle grip on his interview cards. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett begins, his voice oozing artificial sweetness. "Let's talk about your remarkable journey from Trump critic to his second-in-command." Vance returns a measured smile, his eyes reflecting the wisdom born of hard-fought life lessons. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a perfect place to start," he says, "because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." The audience leans forward, surprised by the absence of defensiveness in Vance's response. Bennett shifts in his chair, his carefully rehearsed follow-up suddenly losing its edge. "Growth and understanding?" Bennett mocks, his tone laced with derision. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Some might argue it's just political convenience. "You see, Marcus," Vance replies steadily, "in America, we cherish the tradition of changing our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized the president years ago, I viewed things through a narrow lens. But then, I witnessed something remarkable. I saw his policies begin to help the forgotten Americans I wrote about in my book." For a moment, Bennett's expression tightens imperceptibly. Vance continues, his gaze direct yet unchallenging. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. Have you ever changed your mind about something important? Have you ever looked at the evidence and realized your first judgment might have been wrong?" Bennett's pause lingers a fraction too long. "We're here to talk about your changes, Mr. Vice President, not mine," he snaps, shuffling his cards as if eager to launch his next attack. "Speaking of changes," Bennett continues, "let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The audience tenses. Bennett has just trodden on sacred ground, and the spark in Vance's eyes reveals he's been waiting for precisely this challenge. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" Vance leans forward, his voice filled with conviction. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." A ripple of amen echoes from the crowd. Bennett's jaw clenches. "But surely, in our modern, diverse society," he begins, only to be gently cut off as Vance raises his hand. "Let me finish this thought, because it's important." Vance's tone remains respectful yet firm. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, the same way leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we're establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not merely from government." Bennett glances at his producer, who watches intently from the sidelines. Then, Vance adds, his voice carrying a note of personal reflection. "You know what's interesting, Marcus? When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. And with that, The debate deepens an unexpected clash of convictions that leaves the audience pondering not only the issues at hand, but the very nature of growth, understanding, and the wisdom that spans generations. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions, Vance continues, because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understood there was something deeper than politics. Bennett's face flushes. Let's move on to your relationship with President Trump. Your recent statement about him being God's instrument for America's renewal. Don't you think that's a bit extreme? What I think is extreme, Vance replies calmly, his demeanor unshaken, is how some in the media seem more concerned about a leader who prays than about policies that hurt American families. He pauses, letting his words settle over the silent studio. But since you brought up President Trump, let's talk about results instead of rhetoric. Let's discuss what's really happening in our communities since the inauguration. The studio falls into a remarkable quiet, with even Bennett's trademark rapid-fire interruptions momentarily subdued by Vance's steady presence and measured responses. Bennett's composure begins to crack. Let's talk about your background, Mr. Vice President. You've written about your humble beginnings, yet now you're sitting in the halls of power. Some might say you've forgotten where you came from. That's interesting, Marcus, Vance replies evenly, because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit into the Washington elite's expectations. Character? Bennett scoffs. Is that what you call this complete reversal on Trump? You once wrote quite passionately against him. Yes, I did. And you know what takes more character? Admitting when you're wrong. Standing up for what you believe in, even when people like you twist it into something else. The audience murmurs in agreement. Bennett tugs at his collar, his tone laced with ascension. Mr. Vice President, you've built your reputation as a voice for working-class Americans. Yet, here you are in an expensive suit, defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The temperature in the room seemed to drop as several audience members shifted uncomfortably. But Vance's expression remained unchanged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You know what I see, Marcus? Vance said, his voice steady. I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. Let me tell you something. These values, the ones I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, don't change with your zip code or your job title. Bennett's eyes narrowed. So, you're saying your transformation has nothing to do with political ambition? That we should just ignore your past criticisms? That we should accept you're now President Trump's new? He paused, letting the word hang. Puppet. The word struck the room like a thrown gauntlet. Several audience members gasped audibly. Vance's response came with the precision of a master chess player. You know, Marcus, that word puppet reveals more about you than it does about me. His voice, measured yet laced with steel, continued. In your world, maybe strong loyalty to someone you respect is something to mock. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. He leaned forward slightly. In combat, you judge a person's character by their actions, not by what the media says about them. I've seen President Trump's character firsthand, not the caricature you and your colleagues have created. The audience erupted into applause. Bennett tried to interject, but Vance pressed on. You call it being a puppet. I call it recognizing true leadership when I see it. And yes, I'm proud to serve alongside President Trump. Bennett's voice dripped with sarcasm. A man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once criticized. There you go again, Marcus, Vance replied calmly. You're so focused on finding contradictions that you're missing the point entirely. The real contradiction is ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes, just to please critics like yourself. Thunderous applause followed his words. Bennett glanced at his producer, who gestured frantically from the sidelines. But Vance wasn't finished. And since you brought up my intellectual background, he added with a slight smile, it just goes to show that true wisdom isn't measured by how many contradictions you can find, but by the strength to learn and grow. Why don't we talk about the intellectual dishonesty in your coverage of this administration, Marcus? Bennett bristled. My coverage? He shot back sharply. We're here to discuss it, Vance interjected smoothly. Because just last week, you devoted an entire segment to questioning my faith, suggesting it was nothing more than convenient election season Christianity. Bennett's face reddened. I was merely pointing out the timing, he started. But Vance leaned forward, cutting him off. The timing of what, exactly? The fact that I've been attending the same church since before I entered politics? Or perhaps you'd like to question my grandmother's faith. Too, the woman who taught me to pray before every meal, even when we had little to share. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously at his words. Let me be clear, Marcus, Vance continued, his voice carrying both strength and dignity. You can question my politics. You can disagree with my decisions. But when you start suggesting that my faith is nothing more than a political prop, you're not just attacking me. You're attacking every American who holds their faith dear. Bennett glanced at his notes, clearly searching for safer ground. Let's talk about your recent statements, he insisted. Yes, let's talk about statements, Vance agreed. Like your remark last month that anyone who supports traditional values is, and I quote, living in the past. Tell me, Marcus, do you really think the millions of Americans who go to church every Sunday, who believe in family values, who love their country, are they all just living in the past? A defining silence fell over the studio as Bennett's carefully crafted persona began to crumble. He fumbled with his papers. Mr. Vice President, you're trying to turn this interview around, he stammered. No, Marcus, Vance said steadily. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about the contempt you and your colleagues seem to have for regular Americans. You invited me here thinking you could shame me for my beliefs, my background, and my support for the president. But let's talk about what really bothers you. The studio grew quiet, every eye fixed on him. It bothers you, Vance continued, that someone can come from where I come from and not subscribe to your worldview. It bothers you that I can be educated at the Yale Law School and still hold traditional values. And most of all, it bothers you that I can see right through the game you're playing. Bennett attempted to regain control. Your accusations are, Vance's expression hardened for the first time. They're not accusations, Marcus. They're observations. Like how you rolled your eyes when I mentioned prayer earlier, or how you mockingly referred to my hometown as Trump country on your show last week. His rebuke hit like a thunderclap, leaving the audience in stunned silence. You see, this isn't about politics, Vance continued, his voice firm but controlled. It's about respect. Respect for faith, for traditional values, for the millions of Americans who don't need your approval to love their country or support their president. Bennett's face drained of color as he glanced at his producer, who now watched the exchange with a mix of concern and fascination. Clearly, the interview had veered far from Bennett's planned ambush. Perhaps we should move on, Bennett began, checking his watch. I noticed you've been doing that ever since we started talking about faith and values, Vance observed with a slight smile. Uncomfortable territory for you, Marcus. A few chuckles rose from the audience as Bennett's discomfort became plain to see. For someone who prides himself on hard-hitting journalism, Vance went on, you seem remarkably eager to change the subject when the conversation doesn't go your way. Bennett tried one last attack. Is this the same kind of deflection you used when you switched from criticizing Trump to praising him? There you go again, Marcus, Vance replied calmly. You keep coming back to that, don't you? Let me ask you something. Have you ever changed your mind about someone after getting to know them personally? After seeing their true character instead of relying on media narratives? An elderly woman in the audience called out, Tell him, Mr. Vice President. You know what the real story is here. Marcus Vance's voice carried the weight of conviction. It's not about my past criticisms or my current position. It's about something that terrifies you and your colleagues, the fact that someone can think for themselves, change their mind based on direct experience, and stand firm in their beliefs despite relentless media attacks. Bennett began sweating visibly. "Mr. Vice President, you're twisting my words." And with that, the debate hung in a tense balance. The truth lay bare for all to see. "No, Marcus, I'm just holding up a mirror," Vance interjected calmly. "And I don't think you like what you see, a journalist who came here hoping to embarrass me, only to expose his own prejudices." He turned to address the audience directly. "You see, what Marcus doesn't understand is that true integrity isn't about never changing your mind. It's about having the courage to admit when you're wrong, even when people like him are waiting to pounce." The audience erupted in their loudest applause yet, with even some of the production crew nodding in agreement. "When I first met President Trump, I had a choice," Vance continued, his voice carrying quiet authority. "I could have clung to my preconceptions, or I could judge him by his actions and his genuine love for this country. I chose truth over pride. And that's something your network might want to try sometime." At that, Bennett glanced desperately at his producer, who made a swift slashing motion across his throat, a universal signal to wrap it up. "And you know what else, Marcus? The American people are tired. They're tired of being looked down upon for their faith, tired of being mocked for their values. And most of all, they're weary of journalists who think their job is to tell people what to think instead of reporting the truth." In an instant, the entire studio audience was on its feet. Bennett's attempts to respond were drowned out by thunderous applause as his carefully orchestrated ambush backfired spectacularly. Bennett cleared his throat, his demeanor completely deflated. "Well, I think we're about out of time," he muttered. "Yes, I believe we are," Vance agreed, rising from his chair. "But before I go, I'd like to say one last thing to the American people watching at home." He turned to face the camera directly, his expression sincere and resolute. "What you've witnessed today isn't just about one interview or one journalist's attempt to discredit me. It's about something much more important. It's about standing firm in your convictions. They thought they could shame me for my faith. They thought they could mock my support for President Trump. They thought that they could force me to apologize for believing in traditional values. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't merely political positions. These are the principles that built America, the values that sustained us through hard times, and the truths that will guide us forward." Vance straightened his tie and stood tall. "To every American who's been ridiculed for their faith, mocked for their values, or told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong. Because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe in." As Vance walked off the set, the audience rose in a standing ovation that seemed to shake the studio. Bennett sat in stunned silence, his carefully planned ambush utterly dismantled by a display of unwavering principle and quiet strength. And that proves one thing: sometimes the best response to arrogance is dignity, and the strongest answer to bias is truth. If you enjoyed this story about standing firm in your beliefs, be sure to like and subscribe. And remember, faith, family, and freedom aren't just words. They're the foundation of everything we hold dear. God bless you, and God bless America.